The review station's monitor was the only light left on in the whole wing at 2 in the morning, and Zanil Bekele had been staring at the same 60 wafer images for 11 minutes without blinking, because something in lot 4471 was wrong in a way she couldn't yet name, and PureScan's dashboard, glowing green across every single one of them, clearly disagreed. She hadn't planned to be there that late. She'd come in after an early dinner to catch up on a backlog of raw image spot checks she kept meaning to run and kept letting slide during the day when her calendar filled up with meetings nobody could reschedule, a habit she'd never fully explained to anyone, including herself, beyond a vague sense that the quiet after midnight made it easier to actually look at something instead of skimming it. Most nights she got through her sample, found nothing worth a second glance, and went home. This was not most nights. She zoomed into wafer 41 for the third time. A faint constellation of particulate sat scattered across its surface, so fine it barely registered as texture rather than defect, the kind of thing a tired eye could easily wave off as sensor noise. PureScan had waved it off exactly that way: classification, acceptable process variation, confidence, 89%. She pulled up wafer 42. The same constellation, in nearly the same pattern. 43. 44. 45. By wafer 50 she'd stopped zooming and started counting, and by wafer 60 she had her phone in her hand, thumb hovering over a contact she hadn't called after midnight in over a year. The clean room beyond the review station's glass walls sat empty and blue-lit, equipment humming through its overnight idle cycle, the particular hollow quiet of a fab between shifts that always made her feel like she was the only person left awake in the building, even though she knew perfectly well a night crew was working 2 wings over. Gideon picked up on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately alert in the specific way of someone who'd spent 15 years answering fab emergencies at bad hours. Zanil. What? I need you to look at something before day shift touches lot 4471. PureScan flagging it. That's the problem. It's not. A pause, the sound of him sitting up, a lamp clicking on somewhere in the house he shared with her mother. Then what am I looking at? 60 wafers. Same particulate signature, every one. PureScan's calling all of them acceptable variation, high confidence. I don't recognize this pattern from anything we've ever catalogued, Gideon, and I've been doing this 5 years. Send me the images. She did. She listened to him breathe through them for nearly a minute, the specific silence of a man who used to run this exact review station himself before a promotion moved him 3 floors up and put 50 other lines between him and this kind of 2 in the morning call. It's subtle, he finally said. It could be nothing. It could be 60 wafers of nothing, all with the exact same nothing. I'm not pulling the line at 2 a.m. on a pattern-matching hunch, Zanil. You know what a hold costs us before we've even confirmed there's a problem. I know exactly what it costs. I want the hold anyway. The line went quiet long enough that she checked to see if the call had dropped. Get me confirmation from Fatima before 6, he said. If materials analysis backs you, I'll authorize it myself. If it doesn't, this stays between us, and I don't want it repeated at the ops meeting as me second-guessing my own system on your say-so alone. She almost said something about what your own system was doing to 60 wafers right now. She didn't. Fatima met her in the materials lab at 4:30, still in the sweatshirt she'd clearly thrown on over pajamas, and ran the composition analysis in near silence, the specific focused quiet of someone who understood exactly how much weight a 2 in the morning phone call carried before anyone had to say it out loud. Zanil watched her work through the sample prep in stages, mounting a scraped particulate residue for spectroscopy, running the first pass, frowning at the readout, running it again. Neither of them said much during the wait, the lab's overhead lights harsh and clinical after the softer blue glow of the clean room, the coffee maker in the corner producing something closer to hot brown water than anything either of them intended to actually drink. Fatima had been at this fab longer than either Zanil or Gideon, long enough that she trained under the manual inspection regime PureScan eventually replaced, and Zanil found herself, in the gaps between readouts, wondering what it must have felt like watching a machine take over a skill you'd spent a decade building by hand, And whether Fatima harbored any quiet satisfaction in being the one whose older methods had ended up catching what the machine missed. If she did, she didn't say so, not that night and not later. She just kept running the sample until the numbers were clean enough to trust. The results came back at 551. A particulate signature that matched nothing in 10 years of Kestrel Semiconductor's contamination library. Chemical composition consistent with a specific polymer compound. Fatima traced it, within 20 more minutes, to a gasket material the fab had switched vendors on 6 weeks earlier, a routine procurement change nobody had flagged as a process risk because the new material had passed every standard compatibility test on file. Every test except the one nobody had thought to run, because nobody had thought a gasket swap could produce something PureScan had never been built to recognize as anything other than noise. 6 weeks, Fatima said, reading the timeline off her own notes. Zanil, this has been running since the vendor switch. However many lots have gone through since then, however many the systems called clean dash. I know. How did nobody catch this until you happened to be up at 2 in the morning looking at raw images nobody normally looks at? Zanil didn't have a comfortable answer for that. She still doesn't. She called Gideon at 6:04 with the confirmation. He authorized the full hold within 90 seconds, no further argument, and told her he'd be at the fab within the hour. He was there in 40 minutes. Day shift arrived to find the affected lines already dark, tape across 2 doorways, a hold notice posted where the morning crew would see it before they'd even badged in. Word moved through the building the way it always did, fast and half-accurate, and by 9 o'clock Zanil had fielded 4 separate versions of a rumor about what had actually gone wrong, none of them quite right, one of them wildly worse than reality. One of the line technicians, a broad-shouldered man named Percy who'd worked that exact production bay for 6 years, cornered her near the gowning room around 10, arms crossed, clearly unhappy about a shift's worth of scheduled work sitting idle behind him. PureScan's clean on every one of my wafers, Zanil. You're telling me you pulled 6 weeks of production on something the system's not even flagging? I'm telling you I found something the system's not built to flag, Percy. That's not the same as nothing being there. That's a hell of a distinction to be holding a whole line over. It is, she said. I'm aware. He didn't look satisfied, and she didn't blame him. She wasn't fully satisfied either, not yet, not until Fatima's numbers had come back solid enough to survive exactly this kind of pushback from someone whose own paycheck depended on that line running. The first full day of investigation nearly went sideways entirely. An engineer from the equipment maintenance team, working off Fatima's early composition data before the vendor traceback was complete, spent most of that Tuesday convinced the contamination was coming from a worn seal on an entirely different piece of hardware 3 process steps upstream, a plausible theory that cost the investigation nearly 8 hours before a second spectroscopy pass ruled it out completely. Zanil remembered standing in the equipment bay that afternoon, watching a technician pull apart a component that turned out to have nothing to do with any of it, and feeling the specific, sinking uncertainty of wondering whether she'd been right about the 2 a.m. call at all, or whether she'd simply cost the fab a full day chasing her own instinct in the wrong direction. It was Fatima, running the gasket materials shed particle test late that same evening, who finally closed the loop, matching the compound signature cleanly enough that nobody in the room had any real doubt left by the time she finished walking them through it. What happened over the following week wasn't the conversation either of them would have chosen. 6 weeks of production had to be pulled and re-evaluated. 3 lots that had already shipped required a customer notification neither of them had ever had to draft before, a document that went through 11 revisions and 2 lawyers before anyone was comfortable sending it. The vendor relationship for the gasket material got terminated inside a legal review that took considerably longer than anyone wanted, and at the executive review where Gideon had to explain, in front of people who outranked him, exactly how a system he'd personally championed had spent 6 weeks calling a genuine contamination event acceptable variation. He did not once mention that his stepdaughter was the reason it hadn't gone on 7 weeks, or 8, or however long it would have taken for the yield numbers alone to eventually force the question. Zanil wasn't in that room. She heard about it secondhand from Fatima, who'd been called in to present the chemical analysis herself and who described the plant director's questions as the kind that don't actually want an answer, they want somebody to already be fixing it while they're still asking. She noticed, later, when Gideon finally described the meeting to her himself, that his account skipped the 2 a.m. phone call entirely, folding it into a vaguer, our team caught it during routine review, that made the whole thing sound considerably less like a 5-year-old habit of hers and considerably more like the process working exactly as designed. She didn't bring it up at the time. The customer notification took longer to write than the entire investigation had taken to run. Zanil sat in on the second and fourth drafting sessions, mostly to answer technical questions the legal team kept circling back to, and watched a document shrink and reshape itself across 11 revisions until the specific, plain fact at its center, that a known quantity of affected devices had shipped before the contamination was caught, sat buried under enough careful phrasing that she found herself, on the fourth pass, quietly rewriting one paragraph herself just to make sure it still said what had actually happened. You can't put, the AI failed to detect it, in a customer-facing document, Zanil, the lead attorney told her, not unkindly, crossing it out for the second time. Even if that's technically accurate. It is technically accurate. It's also a sentence our own legal exposure team is going to have feelings about. Say what the corrective action is. Save the mechanism for the internal report. She let that one go, mostly, though she noticed Gideon didn't push back on the cut either, and she wasn't sure yet what to make of that, whether it was simple pragmatism or something closer to a man who'd rather the story of PureScan's blind spot stayed as small as the paperwork would allow. She thought, watching him sign off on the final draft without comment, about how differently he might have argued the point 5 years earlier, back when he was still the one running this exact review station and would have been the person most offended by a document that softened what had actually happened, and she wondered whether that was simply what 15 years in leadership did to a person's instincts or something more specific to him, or something she was reading into a tired man. Signing a document at the end of a long week that had nothing to do with either of those explanations at all. They didn't have it out over dinner. There wasn't a dinner. For most of that week they spoke only in the clipped, functional sentences of two people managing a genuine crisis, timelines, customer language, root cause documentation, and it was nearly 2 weeks before either of them said anything to the other that wasn't strictly about the incident. It was Gideon who brought it up first, in the fab parking lot on a Tuesday evening, both of them heading to their cars at the same unremarkable hour, the sky doing the flat orange-gray thing it did over the parking structure most evenings that time of year. "You went around me," he said. Not accusatory, exactly. Tired. "I called Fatima at 4:30 in the morning because I didn't want to wait for your say-so to find out if I was right. I wasn't going around you, Gideon. I was making sure there was something real to bring you before I asked you to stake anything on it. I know that now. I'm still sitting with how it felt from where I was standing at 2 a.m., getting a call telling me the thing I built might be lying to an entire production line, and not really having a way to check that myself without you. That's the part one don't think either of us has fully solved yet, Gideon. You built something that's supposed to tell all of us what's true. The one time it mattered most, the only way to actually check was a person, at a screen, at 2 in the morning, looking at raw data the system had already decided wasn't worth anyone's attention. He didn't have a clean response to that. Neither did she, really. They stood in the parking lot a while longer, the fab's exterior lights buzzing faintly overhead, a delivery truck idling somewhere near the loading dock, and eventually he said something about the review meeting, some detail about how the plant director had reacted to a specific number, and she realized he wasn't going to say anything about the account he'd given that hadn't quite included her, and she wasn't going to ask him to. I heard how you described it, she said finally. The meeting. What do you mean? Our team caught it during routine review. That's not exactly what happened. He didn't answer right away. It's not exactly not what happened either. Sure. It's just missing the part where it was 2 in the morning, and it was me, and you almost didn't authorize the hold until Fatima backed it up. I authorized it, Zanil. After I pushed. I'm not asking for a medal, Gideon. I'm telling you I noticed. He looked at her for a moment in the flat parking lot light, and whatever he was about to say, he apparently decided against it, because what he actually said was, "I'll do better with that next time," in the specific tone of a man who meant it and also knew perfectly well he might not, and she let that sit between them rather than pushing for anything more definite, because pushing for anything more definite had never once made either of them more honest, only more careful. "I'll see you Sunday," he said. "Maybe," she said, and that was the whole conversation. Her mother called 2 days after that, not about the fab at all, at least not directly. "You've been quiet," she said. "Gideon's been quiet too. Is this a work thing or a you two thing?" "It's a work thing that turned into a bit of both, probably." He mentioned the incident. "Not much beyond that it was serious and it's handled now." "It's handled." "Mostly." "That's not really an answer, Zanil." "I know," she said, and didn't offer a better one, and her mother, who had spent 20 years married to a man who processed most things by working through them alone in a garage or an office rather than talking them out loud, let the silence stand without pushing either. The particular inherited patience of someone who'd learned a long time ago which conversations in this family arrived on their own schedule and which ones never arrived at all if you tried to force them early. PureScan runs differently now. Any equipment or material change anywhere in the fab triggers a mandatory raw image review window, no exceptions, a policy that exists specifically because a system trained on everything that's already happened has no way to prepare for the first time something new does. It's a good fix. Zanil still isn't sure it would have caught lot 4471 in time if she hadn't happened to be up at 2 in the morning looking at 60 images nobody else was looking at. The policy itself came together faster than either of them expected. Once the executive review forced the question, PureScan's engineering team, working directly under Gideon for 3 weeks, built the new review trigger logic and ran it through validation on 2 smaller process changes before rolling it out fleet-wide, a genuinely fast turnaround for a fab that usually moved slower on anything touching production software. Zanil sat in on the final validation review herself, watching a junior engineer walk through a test case that flagged an unfamiliar pattern almost immediately, exactly the way the old system never had, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, closer to the specific relief of watching a problem actually close rather than simply quiet down. She still pulls raw wafer samples every week. She still hasn't fully decided whether that habit is a professional discipline or something closer to not quite trusting the thing that almost let 6 weeks slide by unnoticed. Percy stopped her in the gowning room again about a month later, considerably less confrontational than the first time, mostly just curious. "Heard the whole story finally," he said. "The 2 a.m. thing. Where'd you hear that?" "Fatima mentioned it. You could have told me yourself, you know, instead of just standing there getting yelled at about my line." "You weren't exactly yelling." "I was pretty close to it," he admitted, and something about the exchange, small and slightly awkward and entirely unresolved in the way most workplace friction actually resolves, felt more honest to her than anything from the parking lot conversation had. He didn't apologize outright, and she didn't ask him to. They just stood there another moment in the gowning room doorway, 2 people who'd been genuinely annoyed with each other for good reasons on both sides, before he headed back out to his line and she headed back to the review station, and neither of them mentioned it again after that. 3 months later, at an ordinary Tuesday ops meeting, Gideon presented the new review protocol to the wider engineering staff, and this time, without her asking, without either of them discussing it beforehand, he told the room exactly whose 2 in the morning phone call had started it. It wasn't a big moment. Nobody clapped. Fatima caught Zanil's eye across the room for half a second and looked away again, and the meeting moved on to the next agenda item, budget projections for the following quarter, and that was that. Zanil thought about it on the drive home that evening, the specific unremarkable way a genuine correction had finally landed, 3 months late, in a room full of people mostly thinking about lunch, no dramatic reversal, no speech, just one sentence in the middle of a slide deck that made the actual shape of what had happened finally match what everyone in that room understood about it. She and Gideon talk now. It's not what it was before lot 4471, not exactly, not worse either, just different in a way neither of them has found the right words for yet. Some Sundays she goes to dinner. Some Sundays she doesn't. Nobody's counting, though she suspects, if she asked him directly, he actually might be. She still hasn't asked him directly. Some things, in this family, arrive on their own schedule, if they arrive at all.